I'm Siam. I'm a writer and prose and poetry editor, and I've been asked to share any advice that I've come across over the last 5 or so years editing creative writing. So I've tried to go for the biggest problems I have when it comes to writing. The first one being having a million unfinished drafts. So whether it's in old notebooks or for me it's a folder on my laptop that I don't touch. Just having a really good concept or a few lines and stanzas that you really like, but not being able to flesh them out properly. So I came across these 4 endings by Stanley Kunitz, apparently, although I did find this on Twitter, so I'm sorry if it's not true. But they're helpful anyway to play around with. The first one being circular, so quite self-explanatory, bring back an image or an idea that was introduced earlier. The second is dialectic, so you reach for something that's larger than what came before. In other words, try and put in some kind of epiphany or revelation. With this one, I feel like if it didn't come naturally, it's really not something that I can force, so I don't use it that often. The third one is linear, again self-explanatory. If there's a story element, tell us what happened. And the last one is imagistic, so ending on an evocative image and don't explain it. And that one's my favourite. It does sound like kind of a cop-out, but it's in line with a lot of writing advice that I've been given in a course last year about resisting closure. So you don't need to explain everything to your readers necessarily. You don't need to tie up all of the loose ends. And sometimes it can be more interesting just to let your reader sit with it, your closing lines, and make whatever connections that they want. It also ties in with the advice of moving away from the abstract and focusing on the thinginess of things, which basically means just describing concrete, solid things instead of trying to go like big picture, universal, abstract concepts. I feel like that way it helps to ground your writing a bit and avoid cliches, basically. On the other hand, if you're struggling to start a poem, I've heard a lot of advice about using writing prompts or responding to art and images. Something that I've tried recently, we were working on a collaborative experimental piece for a Glasgow anthology. And we did rituals, so you sit and you force your body to do something, usually repetitively. So like, for example, sitting at your desk on the hour of every hour for the whole day and writing something, responding to something outside your window. Our one was a little different from that. We based our ritual around that Glasgow Watch Twitter bot, the one that retweets you within like half a second. And my ritual was to sit down for an hour and every 10 minutes refresh the page and pick out words from every tweet in sequence and force them into a poem together, essentially. Doing things like this, firstly gets you to loosen up so you're not in your own head as much, and step out of your own sort of style of writing, which can be useful sometimes. And it forces you to play with language in a way that I really normally wouldn't. Like, I happened to do this ritual during the Britain's Got Talent final, so it really forced me to look at words and phrases that would keep on cropping up in a way that I wouldn't normally employ them in my writing. But you can come up with some really cool lines, and you can always come back and revise them after, once you've got your inspiration. So, speaking of Twitter, this is probably the dumbest advice that I could give, but follow bots, genuinely. Like, I follow the Richard Sykin bot, Anne Carson bot, which are 2 of my favourite poets, POC literature bot, there's a queer literature bot, and the concepts bot, which basically just strings together random words to make nonsense imagery. But sometimes it can be really poetic and beautiful. What I find helpful about that is that I personally struggle to make time to sit and read a whole chapbook. I think that reading is the age-old advice, that reading is the best way to improve your writing, and that is true. But I don't find a lot of time to read necessarily something cover to cover. So with this, it's just daily snippets of inspiration, like a random quote that I come across on my timeline every few hours. Especially with the POC Lit bot, then if it's a quote that I really like, then I will go and look up that poet, and it's a way to discover new people that you maybe wouldn't ordinarily come across. And on that note, I really like reading things in translation. I really like to just pull a line from my poem and put it in Google Translate and see how it comes out and how it's relayed in different languages. Just to give you an idea of how different metaphors or idioms will work in different languages, and kind of loosen up the restrictions a little bit. So at the moment I'm working on a manuscript for an illustrated book of folk tales. And last year I did Ancient Hebrew, which both these things are really interesting to start from scratch and learning the alphabet or a whole new script and seeing how these sentences develop is really quite interesting to me. Similarly, playing around with space and how it changes the rhythm when you're reading. All of these things are quite new to me, but it's probably the best bit of advice that I can give. Just if you've been doing the same kind of writing for quite a while, this kind of breaks you out of that mold a little bit. Just having a bit more fun with it. I know it's really cliche, I was really trying not to be cheesy in this, but just messing about and seeing what happens. So that's probably the best advice I can give.